Afternoon and welcome to the 2025 President's Lecture. I'm Jackie Morris, I'm the Deputy Clerk of the Senate, and we're meeting today at Parliament House, which is the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their long custodianship of this land over millennia. I also acknowledge any other First Nations people who are joining us today and our host of the lecture, the President of the Senate, the Honourable Sue Lines, and any senators and members who have joined us, as well as our audience. It's lovely to have such a large audience in person, but there's always also a crowd joining us online. Today's lecture is being live streamed and it will be followed by a question and answer session with the Speaker and with the President. The President of the Senate, Senator Lines, has represented the state of Western Australia in the Senate since 2013. She was first elected as the President of the Senate in 2022 and recently re-elected for a second term. The President is the first female Labor President of the Senate and the second female President following Senator Margaret Reid. In her time in the Senate, the President has represented Australia at the United Nations Women's Forum, delivered statements as National Delegation Leader at the Women Political Leaders Reykjavik Global Forum, and has produced reports calling for gender equality at the Inter-Parliamentary Union, as well as the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Please join me in welcoming the President of the Senate.
Thanks very much, Jackie. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Australian Parliament today, and thank you very much, Kate, for agreeing to do this President's Lecture. Kate has her family here today, so it's a real family affair, but I'm really excited and keen to hear from Kate. I too pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples and welcome any First Nations people we have in the room today. So Kate, of course, needs no introduction to the Australian Parliament, but her depth of experience goes much greater than the work she did here on behalf of the Australian Parliament to make this a much safer and more respectable workplace. And there's been a lot of change since Kate's report, but it is still a work in progress. But Kate is a real authority on Australian workplaces, particularly in relation to safety and respect, but no doubt her talk today will cover some of that. Kate is currently the chair of the Australian Sports Commission and she got to go to the recent games. I saw all of her Instagram posts, was very jealous. She is the chair of Creative Workplace Council and she's the recent president of the Australian Red Cross. And the first thing I did when she told me about it, said to her, I gave plasma last week. Her husband is giving blood next week and I'm sure many of you are blood donors and you can all tell Kate later that you're doing that. So without further ado, could you please give a big warm welcome for Kate Jenkins, AO, to deliver the 2025 President's Lecture, Sisters in Law, Australian Parliament's Important Role in Advancing Gender Equality. So thank you, Kate.
Thank you for that kind introduction and thank you for everyone making time to be here today. So my first priority is also to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Canberra region, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters and community. And in this place, I also acknowledge and thank the First Nations people who've served here as parliamentarians, as staffers and as public servants. And thank you for making time. As the President has mentioned, I'm delighted my husband and 2 children are here to hear my reflections on the important role played by those who work in our parliaments for all Australians. So, As a girl raised on a family orchard in a loving and humble family, with both parents having left school at the age of 15, it is a remarkable privilege to be standing in the Australian Parliament to present the Senate President's Lecture for 2025. So thank you, President Lyons, for your kind invitation to speak today. It's a real honour. In 1968, I was born to a mother with a strong sense of justice, fairness and equality. Let me paint a picture of conditions for women like my mum in the 1960s. Women made up only 1 in 5 undergraduate university student enrolments. The pill was expensive and only available to married women. Marital rape was lawful. Abortion was a criminal offence. Women were forced to resign from the public service upon marriage. Women were paid, by law, 75% of the male wage. Sexual harassment was lawful and not unusual. Women's most common role was home duties. Out of the home, women were encouraged towards care and support jobs like teaching, nursing and secretarial duties. There was no entitlement to maternity leave or government-funded childcare, and in 1960 there were only 4 women, all senators, of the total 184 members in the Australian Parliament. Over the course of my lifetime, the Australian Parliament has passed important laws which have contributed to significant improvements for women in health, education, employment and politics. While every law passed in this place affects women, I'd like to talk today about the vital role the Australian Parliament has played over the last 50 years in turning advocacy, leadership and momentum for social change into enforceable laws that promote gender equality, which are globally recognised as effective and leading. But before I dive into the laws of the Federal Parliament, let me give you a whirlwind tour of the waves of feminism that have influenced Australia to give you a sense of the social context over the last century. What is now described as first wave feminism was the 19th century women's rights movement that won women's suffrage. In 1902, Australia became the first nation to secure equal suffrage, giving women the vote and the right to stand for election. The suffrage movement also challenged the notion that women were unsuited for higher learning, paving the way for the first female graduate in fields like teaching, medicine and law. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s, 70s and 80s is referred to as second wave feminism. In Australia, the movement split into the women's liberation movement, exposing attitudes of sexism, misogyny, subordination and oppression of women, and the policy-focused women's electoral lobby, including women who would become politicians, femocrats and change makers. Second wave feminism questioned the traditional role of women as mothers, carers and homemakers, pressed for gender equity measures in health, education and employment, and demanded anti-discrimination legislation. Third wave feminism is traced to Anita Hill's televised testimony in 1991 to an all-male, all-white Senate Judiciary Committee that Judge Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her. Upon Judge Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court, journalist Rebecca Walker wrote in Ms. Magazine, "So I write this as a plea to all women, especially women of my generation. Let Thomas's confirmation serve to remind you, as it did to me, that the fight is far from over. Let this dismissal of a woman's experience move you to anger." The challenge facing my generation of third wave feminism was the claim that gender equality had already been achieved via the first 2 waves, and further attempts to push for women's rights were irrelevant and unnecessary, or perhaps even pushed the pendulum too far in women's favour. This challenge continues today. Fourth wave feminism started around 2012, coinciding with the digital age, and focuses on sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual violence, the objectification of women and sexism in the workplace. Feminist activism has broadened to address the intersecting impacts of race, class, sexuality, gender identity and disability. And I pay tribute to my Sex Discrimination Commissioner successor, Dr. Anna Cody, for her focus on intersectionality. It also advocates for equal incomes regardless of sex, demands women's opportunities for leadership and power, and challenges traditional gender roles for men and women. We now understand that binary references to women and men does not accurately reflect how people experience sex and gender. While I will speak about historical concepts of feminism and women's rights, I intend my language to be inclusive of all genders. It's my belief, and it's the law, that all people, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, or sex characteristics, are entitled to equal treatment, free from unlawful discrimination, harassment, and victimisation. It's against this history that I started my position as Sex Discrimination Commissioner in 2016. Many women before me, including my predecessors, Pam O'Neill, Dame Quentin Bryce, Sue Walpole, Susan Halliday, Prue Goward and Liz Broderick, have all made a significant contribution towards Australia's improved position on rights for women and LGBTIQ+ communities. In 2016, my first task was to connect with Australians in all their diversity, take stock of the progress that had been achieved, and identify what needed further attention to advance gender equality. One of my early reference points was looking at the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report. Started in 2006, the report provides a basis for the analysis of gender parity developments across 2/3 of the world's economies, measured across 4 key domains: health and survival, educational attainment, economic participation and opportunity, and political empowerment. And in 2006, Australia was ranked 15th out of 115 countries. 10 years later, in 2016, Australia was ranked 46th out of 144 countries, its worst rating since the index commenced. I observed that the Sex Discrimination Act had been a powerful tool to educate the community, reduce the overt discrimination, and create mechanisms for people to bring complaints of discrimination, sexual harassment, and victimisation. But there was still institutional and attitudinal resistance to change. Ranking at 46 in the world, I knew we were still a long way from gender equality. I knew that advancing equality was not simply a matter of changing attitudes. Progress requires changing systems and structures to prevent discrimination and promote equality. It requires embedding the progress that we have achieved. And importantly, it requires our Parliament to pass and improve the laws. In my speech today, I'll explain the Australian journey across those 4 domains of the Global Gender Gap Index in the last 50 years, including the remarkable leaders who've moved gender equality forward, sometimes in the face of strong resistance, and how parliamentary lawmaking has been central to the positive changes Australians have witnessed. The first domain is health and survival, which measures sex ratio at birth and healthy life expectancy. The sex ratio at birth variable aims to capture the phenomenon of missing women, prevalent in many countries with a strong son preference. I'm grateful Australia is not one of these countries, and I'm sure my daughter Millie is also grateful. The healthy life expectancy variable measures the estimated number of years women and men can expect to live in good health, taking into account the years lost to violence, disease, malnutrition, and other relevant factors. On this measure, Australia performs relatively well as a nation. However, the results for our First Nation community are still unacceptable. When I cast back 5 decades, I'm grateful to be able to draw on the wisdom of a number of women leaders who were key players for advancing the rights of women. While women like Susan Ryan and Beatrice Faust have passed, we are lucky that we can still say thank you to pioneering women who've achieved many of the reforms we take for granted, like Wendy McCarthy, Pam O'Neill, Dr. Anne Summers, Elizabeth Reed, Sarah Dowse, Chris Ronalds, Mari Coleman, Dame Quentin Bryce, Margaret Thornton, Marianne Sawyer, and many others. And some of you might be in the room today, but I haven't spotted. Wendy McCarthy, who I know is joining online, has consistently said, if you don't have health and education, you can't have equality. Wendy says that the single biggest development for women's economic, social and political rights was the ability to choose when and if to have children. And that's why the first law I want to highlight is, perhaps unexpectedly, in the area of taxation. Let me explain why, with a little help from Marianne Sawyer's wonderful history of the women's electoral lobby in Australia called Making Women Count. The Australian Women's Electoral Lobby, or WEL, was inspired by an article published in the first edition of Gloria Steinem's new Ms. magazine, which is the other slide up there, where US presidential candidates were asked about and rated against various social, policy and women's rights issues. In Melbourne, Beatrice Faust was tired of the talk of the women's liberation movement and wanted action. In February 1972, Beatrice brought together a hand-picked group of women to see if they could replicate the American exercise, and so WEL was born, which quickly became a national movement of women deployed to interview over 600 federal candidates about 45 items, including topics such as abortion, family planning, sexual health, discrimination against women, equal pay, childcare, education issues, and women in politics and government. It's remarkable that many of the issues covered in 1972 are still the issues that are relevant today. At the time WEL was founded, women's right to control her own fertility was a particularly urgent issue. There was a ban on advertising contraceptives, as well as sales tax and tariffs that made them unnecessarily expensive. As WEL pointed out, the sales tax of 27% on the pill was the same as applied to the mink fur coat. Wendy McCarthy was a WEL founder in Sydney. She had herself had a covert abortion in 1963 at the age of 22, at the cost of 63 guineas and at a time when the doctor and the woman faced a risk of up to 10 years jail. In October 1972, McCarthy was one of the 80 women who signed a petition published in the Nation Review titled, "We have had abortions and are willing to admit it in the interests of legislative change." WEL produced posters demanding safe, cheap contraception and the right to advertise it, held public forums, and started to write submissions to government. Things happened quickly after Whitlam was elected in 1972, and in the absence of their own women's policy, many of the items on the WEL questionnaire became government policy. On his third day in office, I know you can't read that, by the way, but this is the press statement. From his third day in office, Prime Minister Whitlam announced that oral contraceptives prescribed by a doctor would become available as a pharmaceutical benefit and would be exempt from luxury tax. Advertising was also permitted in the ACT and Northern Territory. The deceptively, boringly named Sales Tax, open brackets, Exemptions and Classifications, close brackets, Act 1973, received assent on 11th April 1973, backdated to the 8th of December 72. New women's services received support, including women's refuges, rape crisis centres, family planning centres, and women's health centres. These were significant achievements for women's health and opportunities. McCarthy has continued as a vocal advocate for decriminalising abortion. With the passing of West Australia's abortion laws in 2023, abortion by doctors has now been decriminalised and replaced by health-focused laws in each state and territory of Australia. This is a welcome and long fought for development. It's timely that, as recently as Monday, the Minister for Women, Senator the Honourable Kate Gallagher, said, "We know that women's health can't be separated from women's equality. If women aren't healthy, they can't participate in work, family or community life." So recent reforms on women's health care are covering topics like perimenopause and menopause, periods and contraception, endometriosis and pelvic pain. There are even new contraceptive pills being added to the PBS for the first time in 30 years. While Australia now ranks highly for healthy life expectancy, women's health is still significantly affected by the impacts of domestic, family and sexual violence. Over the years, Australian parliaments have considered and passed laws prohibiting rape in marriage, coercive control and technology-facilitated abuse, reformed the family laws system and established a domestic, family and sexual violence commission. Violence against women continues to be a major issue in Australia, as confirmed by Natasha Stott-Despoja's recently released Royal Commission report called With Courage, South Australia's Vision Beyond Violence. In particular, Commissioner Stott-Despoja said the violence experienced by young Aboriginal people was a statewide shame, with 1 in 7 having experienced family, domestic or sexual violence. Indeed, on all 4 Global Gap Index measures, the results for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people show that we're a long way from equality. For example, the July data from the Productivity Commission for the National Agreement for Closing the Gap shows that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander females born in 2020 to 2022 are expected to live to 75.6 years. That is 8.1 years less than non-Indigenous females. We can do better to improve the outcomes for First Nations people, including in health, education, economic opportunity and political empowerment. We must do better. The second measure, educational attainment, is measured by literacy rate and enrolment in primary, secondary and tertiary education. Australia is ranked highly on educational attainment since the index commenced, but this was not always the case. Throughout the early 20th century, formal education beyond primary and lower secondary levels remained largely inaccessible to most women. Higher learning was available only to a privileged few and in confined areas like teaching and nursing. After World War II, government investment in education fuelled the expansion of secondary schools, technical colleges and universities, and expanded the number of scholarships that were also available to women. The rise of second wave feminism brought substantial pressure for equality in education. Free tertiary education in the 70s and 80s made it more accessible to working and middle class people. In 1986, the year I started university, women accounted for approximately 50% of all university students in Australia, marking the first year female enrolments matched those of males. By 2022, women made up just over 60% of undergraduates and postgraduate student enrolments. Australia has now achieved near parity between female and male enrolments in primary, secondary and tertiary education. However, women remain unrepresented in STEM degree programs and senior leadership positions, and there are still challenges in attracting people of diverse cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, including First Nations students. The first major project I worked on as Sex Discrimination Commissioner was a 2016 survey of the student experience of sexual assault and sexual harassment in Australia's 39 universities. It was the result of long-time advocacy by current and former student leaders, advocates and NRAPE on campus. Former UTS Women's Officer and now Minister for Social Services, the Honourable Tanya Plibersek, attended the survey launch. Our Change the Course report, published in 2017, found that 51% of students had experienced sexual harassment in 2016, and 6.9% of students had experienced sexual assault in 2015 or 2016. We made 9 recommendations directed towards universities, but I will confess, as a then new Sex Discrimination Commissioner, I was not brave or experienced enough to recommend legislative change alongside our structural recommendations for universities. Unfortunately, the follow-up survey 5 years later showed little real progress, and so I welcome the government's action following their release of the university's Accord report in 2024. The significant reforms since the Accord introduced by Education Minister, the Honourable Jason Clare, include legislation passed in November 2024 establishing the National Student Ombudsman under the Ombudsman Act 1976. The interim Australian Tertiary Education Commission commenced on the 1st of July this year, with consultation underway prior to passing of legislation. And just last week, on the 25th of August, Parliament passed the Universities Accord National Higher Education Code to Prevent and Respond to Gender-Based Violence Bill 2025. Other significant reforms affecting the experience of young people in education, public settings and online include reforms in several states and territories to amend the legal definition of sexual consent to an affirmative model of consent that requires a person to take active steps to say or do something to find out whether the other person consents to the sexual activity, inspired by the advocacy of Saxon Mullins and others. Introduction of mandatory consent education for kinder to year 10 secondary school students and an increased awareness of the impacts of porn, strangulation, stalking and stealthing, thanks to the advocacy of Chanel Contos and others. And under the leadership of Australia's E-Safety Commissioner, Julian McGrath, we've seen enhanced laws on tech-facilitated abuse, surveillance and image-based abuse. And most recently, the social media minimum age laws introduced by Minister for Communication, the Honourable Annika Wells, with more reforms foreshadowed to protect against abusive technology. These are significant and much needed reforms supporting educational attainment for all Australians. Economic participation and opportunity is measured in three ways, looking at the participation gap, the remuneration gap, and the advancement gap based on those data points listed. A number of the questions covered in the first WELL candidate survey related to factors that created barriers to women's workforce participation and earning potential. Reforms since 1972 include abolishing the marriage bar to the public service, extending the adult minimum wage to women, laws for equal pay and paid parental leave, rights to flexible working arrangements, and supporting accessible and affordable childcare. Central to advancing workplace rights for women was the introduction and evolution of the Sex Discrimination Act and its baby sister, the Affirmative Action Act. I was very lucky when I started at the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2016 that the Honourable Susan Ryan AO was the Age and Disability Discrimination Commissioner. While I'd read about the history of how the Sex Discrimination Act was born, it was fascinating to hear the story directly from Susan herself. The 1972 WELL candidate survey included discrimination legislation as a priority. However, the new Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, moved on the Racial Discrimination Act first. A proposed bill to prohibit discrimination against persons by reason of their sex or marital status was circulated in 1975, but not actioned before the dismissal in November. WELL had more success in South Australia in 1975 and Victoria and New South Wales in 1977, where anti-discrimination legislation was passed. Under the new Fraser government, from 1975, the Honourable Bob Ellicott AC was appointed as the Minister responsible for Women's Affairs. Ellicott told the new National Women's Advisory Council that the government was considering sex discrimination legislation. At this time, a new group, Women Who Want to Be Women, or 4W, were emerging in opposition to sex discrimination laws, supported by National Party members in Cabinet. Ellicott was unable to progress his planned legislation, although he did manage to sign the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, on behalf of the Australian Government in 1981. As an aside, As Minister of Home Affairs and ACT, Ellicott devised a concept for a national high-performance sporting facility, a concept which led to the opening of the Australian Institute of Sport in Canberra in 1981, also now part of the Australian Sports Commission, of which I am chair. Former school teacher and WELL founder Susan Ryan was elected to the Senate for the ACT in 1975. With assistance from lawyer Chris Ronalds, Ryan used her time in opposition to introduce a private senator's bill, the Sex Discrimination Bill, in 1981. With the election of the new Hawke government in 1983, Senator Ryan, now Minister for Education, Youth Affairs and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Status of Women, the Sex Discrimination Bill was reintroduced in June 1983 and CEDAW was ratified by July. At this stage, a public furore erupted. This slide is a copy of Chris Ryan's all-time favourite advertisement from October 1983. Stop Ryan, Australia's feminist dictator. Stop Ryan's ruthless juggernaut. Stop Ryan's anti-female sex bill. Susan told me that fears expressed were that removing sex barriers to jobs would mean the death of the family, destruction of the labour market, wrecking of the economy, end of marriage, collapse of Christianity. 30 years later, Susan was pleased to confirm that none of these things had occurred. To progress the bill in face of opposition, Ryan was pragmatic and negotiated and renegotiated the bill until it was passed and commenced more than 12 months later on the 1st of August 1984. One of the compromises was to remove the direct obligations on employers in the Act. Susan told me in 2016 that she was always surprised that no obligations on employers had been subsequently added to the Act even after the fears subsided. The first Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Pamela O'Neill, might be in the room. Yes, thank you for coming, Pamela, was well credentialed to embrace the role. O'Neill was a former biochemist who'd served as a member of the Legislative Assembly in the Northern Territory from 1977 to 1983, including having proposed a private member's bill on sex discrimination for the Northern Territory. I'm delighted that you're here today, Pam. When I asked Pam what her initial priorities were, she basically told me establishing the office, educating employers and community, and handling complaints. For example, O'Neill recalls writing to newspapers to inform that they could no longer divide classified job advertisements between those for men and boys and those for women and girls. The annual report of 1984-85 says the publicity associated with the Sex Discrimination Act was the biggest venture by the Commission so far into press advertising, direct mailing and other advertising techniques. Commissioner O'Neill quickly became a radio and television presence, reminding Australians that women could not be dismissed from employment due to pregnancy, that people should not be denied rental accommodation or insurance because they were single, that women were able to seek full membership of golf clubs and play on weekends, that non-combat roles in defence were now open to women, and that sexual harassment at work was finally prohibited. The Act has continued to evolve since 1984, with significant reforms in 2013, adding the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, and marital or relationship status to the grounds of prohibited discrimination. After consultations led by the head of the Office of Status of Women, Dr. Anne Summers, the affirmative action sections of the original Sex Discrimination Bill were passed into new law in 1986, when the Affirmative Action Agency was established, which became the Equal Opportunity for Women in the Workplace Agency in 1999 and evolved into the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in 2012. Just last week, Minister Gallagher tabled the Workplace Gender Equality Agency's biennial progress report in Parliament, which sets out the progress of Australian employers against 6 key gender equality indicators. It shows that Australia's world-leading gender equality reporting program has helped to achieve significant improvements in gender equality in the workplace over the last 10 years of reporting to WGEA, including a decrease in the total remuneration pay gap of 7.5% points down from 28.6% to 21.1%, and an increase in women managers, 42% up from 36%. The 2017 reporting of sexual harassment and rape by Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein reinvigorated a global conversation that was called #MeToo, including in Australia. In 2018, the Honourable Kelly O'Dwyer was the new Minister for Women and Minister for Finance. When #MeToo hit, Minister O'Dwyer supported me to lead the Respect at Work inquiry, which found that sexual harassment was still a regular experience in Australian workplaces. In typical Aussie spirit, Minister O'Dwyer said she did not just want to hear about the problems, she wanted me to recommend solutions. Our inquiry found that in the absence of any positive obligation on employers to prevent sexual harassment, the laws had created a complaints-based system that placed the burden of enforcement on the victims. While Australia has excellent workplace and health and safety laws, they were not aligned or effective in preventing sexual harassment, which was costing individuals, employers, and the economy dearly. That's why the cornerstone Respect at Work reform is the employer duty, what's called the positive duty with the mandatory 7 standards. The former and current governments together accepted and have implemented all recommendations of the Respect at Work report, starting with the 2021 changes to the Fair Work Act and Sex Discrimination Act, and the positive duty was passed by the 47th Parliament in December 2022, and the Human Rights Commission commenced enforcement from December 2023. Boards and executives are now responsible for preventing sexual harassment by taking action against all 7 standards, not for just responding to complaints. Susan Ryan would be pleased to know that finally the SDA has an employer duty. The final area of focus, political empowerment, is measured by women in Parliament, women in ministerial positions, and years with a female head of state measuring the last 50 years. I'm happy to say that this is an area that Australia has greatly progressed in recent years. The title of this speech is Sisters-in-Law, not because women who've advocated for change were lawyers, although some of them were, but because they've all contributed to the momentum towards the Australian Parliament introducing important laws that progress gender equality, whether as advocates, bureaucrats, politicians, or otherwise. I've already mentioned that in 1902, Australia became the first nation to introduce equal suffrage, allowing women to both vote and stand for election. However, it took another 41 years for the first women to be elected to the Australian Parliament, Dorothy Tagney and Enid Lyons in 1943. Enid being the grandmother of the influential changemaker and my good friend Libby Lyons. While some women were running for elected office in the 1970s, Australia also saw a wave of women taking up roles within the public service. And this is where I ask, is Marion Sawyer? Yes, Marion's here. I have drawn very much on Marion's work in this talk. So, to quote Marion Sawyer, the term femocrat was invented in Australia originally as a derogatory term to describe feminists entering policy positions in government. Subsequently, it's been used more neutrally to describe feminists in government, whether in women's policy agencies or elsewhere, and whether at national, subnational or transnational levels of government. By the 1980s, hundreds of femocrats worked throughout the Australian government. While the role of the Sex Discrimination Commissioner might have been described as a femocrat in 1984, by the time I started as the 7th Sex Discrimination Commissioner in 2016, it was a highly respected independent role responsible for promoting gender equality in Australia. At the time I was appointed, I was asked by media whether I would focus my work on advancing gender equality in politics. My response was that Parliament was one workplace and I intended to focus on a range of workplaces across the country. This audience well knows I became increasingly convinced of the importance for all workplaces of this Parliament being a safe, respectful and diverse workplace. The Respect at Work report was tabled in Parliament on the 5th of March 2020, and soon after the parliamentary agenda turned towards the global challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. With a minority of women in Cabinet, I convened with my national colleagues from WGEA, eSafety, Our Watch, Ambassador for Women in STEM, Gender Equality Ambassador and the Office for Women to consider how we could support government's rapid-fire decisions to ensure they adequately considered the interests of women and diverse communities. In February 2021, after hearing Australian of the Year Grace Tame speak, former staffer Brittany Higgins spoke out about her alleged rape in this building. On the 5th of March 2021, exactly 1 year after the Respect at Work report had been tabled, Senator the Honourable Simon Birmingham announced that, with cross-parliament support, I would lead the Australian Human Rights Commission's independent review of Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces with the goal of making recommendations to ensure the Australian Parliament was the best practice workplace. And I acknowledge Rachel Thompson in this room today as well. It was a great privilege to hear the experiences of current and former parliamentarians, staffers, parliamentary department staff, public servants, contractors, and even the press gallery, all who make up the diverse workforce of our Parliament. I thank those people, some of whom are in this room and online today. In simple numbers, we learnt that 1 in 2 workers then in Parliament had experienced bullying, sexual harassment, or actual or attempted sexual assault. We heard the drivers and risk factors that exist in this unique workplace and were able to draw on lessons from similar reviews conducted in other Westminster systems like the UK, Scotland, New Zealand and Canada, as well as drawing on our expertise gathered from our Respect at Work inquiry. Our report, Set the Standard, was delivered on the 29th of November 2021 and tabled in Parliament the next day, which was the last sitting day for 2021. On return in 2022, the government accepted all 28 recommendations and appointed a cross-parliamentary leadership task force to oversight implementing the recommendations. After the May 2022 election, the refreshed leadership task force, pictured here, continued the work, achieving the following legislative reforms amongst other changes. I'm regularly asked whether I believe things are better now in Parliament. Based on the regular conversations I have with people who work here, I can say without doubt, yes. If you asked me if this is the perfect workplace, I can say without doubt, no. I know that this is a complex workplace and the reforms are new, so 4 years along, now would be a good time to review progress and identify what's going well and what could be done better. I also acknowledge that people will still carry with them the legacy of past poor workplace experiences. New reforms can't necessarily repair past hurt, however supports are now available, and I hope those people are accessing the supports they might need to move forward. Set the Standard identified the need for greater diversity among parliamentarian staffers and departments as a protective factor for a safe and respectful workplace. And it's pleasing to see the increased diversity of our Parliament since. In April 2016, 73 or 32% of the 226 seats in federal parliament were held by women. The current 48th Parliament is an historic gender equal parliament. Women hold 49.5% seats in Parliament, so 112 of the 226 seats. For the first time since Federation, we have a gender equal federal cabinet and gender balance in ministerial positions. In its 30-year review of women in Parliament, 1995 to 2025, the Interparliamentary Union called out Australia for significant progress. It said, the Australian Parliament has seen the biggest gain in women's representation in the Pacific region over the last 30 years. The country has also been leading the way on addressing gender-based violence against women in Parliament. I was pleased to see the IPU describe the Set the Standard reforms aimed to improve the parliamentary workplace culture, noting the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission, the Parliamentary Workplace Support Service, and the new codes of conduct for parliamentarians, staffers, and all those who enter parliamentary spaces. So Australia now ranks 19th for political empowerment on the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index, a huge improvement on the past. In conclusion, I hope you've been invigorated today hearing about just some of Australia's progress on gender equality over the last 50 years. The progress driven by talented, determined sisters working together, supported by men, responding to changing community expectations, and scaffolded by essential laws passed through our federal Houses of Parliament. Now, you might be wondering how we have ranked overall on the Global Gender Gap Index since 2016. Well, it got worse before it got better. Our lowest ranking occurred in 2021, when we were ranked 50th out of 156 countries, a notable year when 3 young women spoke out about their treatment, Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins and Chanel Contos, and when Australians marched for justice in the streets across the country. It was the same year the government responded to all 55 recommendations of the Respect at Work report and commissioned the independent review of Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. The good news is that in 2025, Australia ranked at its highest ever level, at 13th out of 148 countries. This is not an accident. It is the result of 50 years of hard work. So I say thank you to our sisters-in-law for helping make laws to support gender equality. From Wendy McCarthy to Brittany Higgins, from candidate surveys to policy, from sales tax reform to sex discrimination laws, from advocates to femocrats to parliamentarians, every voice and every law has made a difference. Thank you. All good.
Wow, I think she deserves another clap.
Thank you. I want to turn the spotlights up there because I know some of the people I spoke about are in this room and some who I didn't speak about are in this room as well who've made a huge difference. So thank you for coming.
And I know Jackie's going to share this and give people the opportunity to ask questions, but that was such breadth. It's a terrific analysis of the good, the bad and the ugly of where we've been and where we've come to. So thank you, Kate, for doing that. I don't think anyone else has quite captured what you captured today. So I think that is an absolute worthy piece and a good reminder of what we've still got to do. So thank you.
So I'm in charge of wrangling questions, which I see there's one in the middle here already. Just if you can do that, if you can pop your hand up and we'll bring a mic to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks so much for that talk. My name's Anna Huff, I used to work here. I just wanted to ask a question about Set the Standard. I wanted to thank you, Kate, for your work on the Set the Standard report. It was an excellent report. I'm one of the people who made a submission to that report. You mentioned that reforms can't necessarily do much about past harm. I'm somebody who was sexually assaulted in a parliamentary workplace and who was subsequently bullied and discriminated against in this building. I think that there are some reforms that can be done, particularly a redress scheme for staff, the government not dragging out settlement processes, the government not pressuring survivors into signing NDAs against its own policy, and the government holding people accountable. One of the people who believe me still works here. I'd be interested in your comments on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And it did, I mean, not just in this piece of work, other pieces of work I've done, hearing the lived experience of people, both creative solutions, that was a really good example that most of the people who contributed to that and the Respect at Work report really did it because they wanted the places to be better. And I know Anna is one of those people who wants this place to be better. So those are some of the suggestions. At the point that we did the Set the Standard review, we made the recommendations we made. We could see there was, as you know, President, as one of the people responsible, that the Parliament didn't have basic infrastructure, that people did feel like there was no accountability, and there really was no accountability. There was no code of conduct, there was no place to go, there was no place for supports. But people like you were who I'm acknowledging. I think that when we talk about work in progress, it can feel really hard to listen to if you are still feeling the pain, but also feel like it's not enough. So everything that you've said, those ideas are really valuable ideas to contribute. So thank you.
Kate, thank you very much. Kim Rubinstein from the University of Canberra and ANU. Kate, I wanted to see if we could link the beginning of your talk about the importance of changing systems and structures and how there's often resistance to that with the wonderful sort of change that has occurred practically with women, but that the question mark which you ended with is how well the culture is necessarily changing. And as a sort of constitutional law thinker and professor, the Constitution and the structure of Parliament and the adversarial nature is part of it. As you know, there's some attention to job sharing in Parliament, and that's going to be heard by the Federal Court over the next year or so. But job sharing is an initiative for workplaces in that diversity space. I'm curious to know how much you've been in your work paying attention to that as a way of enabling greater diversity, not only in terms of carers, but also with people with disabilities, and broadening the participation of a more sort of varied Australian society, not only in Parliament but beyond.
Thank you, Kim. And a deep thinker and someone who is absolutely one of those women, literally a sister-in-law in the legal understanding how the laws can be used. So I'll respond to that in two ways. One is the question about Parliament. So one of the things, and again, the President knows this well, when we did this piece of work, and everyone here will know this as well, the Parliament is Defence is a unique workplace. The Sports Commission is a unique workplace. So there are lots of places are quite unique. But the Parliament makes the laws and has to, is its own ecosystem to create its own laws. So the question that is going to be before the Federal Court about job share in elected officials is something that I will look at with great interest as the outcome. It's not that long ago, so for 20 years I was an employment lawyer, and that I started in 93, and from 93 to now, this is like another complete world. So in 1993, you got a job, you worked full-time, and you did it in this, and you work more than full-time depending on where you work. Over the course of that 20 years, both as an employer at that law firm, but also as an advisor, the use of job share, part-time and flexible working arrangements just went from 0 to 100. The reality was that it was driven by women with caring responsibilities, which still reflects the societal stereotype of women care and men earn the money. So whilst those reforms were fantastic, and I have had just consistently you get 2 for 1 on job share. So I've had job share EAs, I've had job share, lawyers working for me, and it's absolutely a brilliant formula where everyone's happy, plus you get two brains, so it's fantastic. But the challenge has been in that era that because it was mostly taken up by women, and because in those days the men who were mostly the bosses were looking at who they could see around, the part-time flexible working arrangements weren't getting the promotion opportunities, they weren't getting paid as well, they were often not being regarded as something you could do at a senior level. So we had a good development, but also an unintended consequence that those women weren't getting the opportunities. I think we're moving. I think COVID really changed attitudes, but we've still got, the statistics still tell us that we still live a stereotyped, heteronormative kind of model of woman is primarily responsible for care, men for work. But as we change that, and I can say, they're here, but we haven't followed that model in my family. It makes a huge difference to your family, it makes a huge difference to your income, and it makes a huge difference to our society. So that move towards more men taking caring responsibility and us making sure that's possible has been a great development. Do you get to answer anything, President?
I
can ask you one.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. I just
Don't ask me about standing orders.
Right.
I'd have to ask you.
You can have
That'd
a
be an
chat.
own goal, wouldn't it? I think one of the things that was coming out through the lecture is there's a lot we take for granted now, and it's good to reflect on what's changed and how things have become embedded. Did you want to reflect on the change that you've seen over your time, either in workplaces or in politics?
Yeah, so like Kate, I have spent most of my working life in employment, working for a trade union. I work for United Workers Union, which covers low-paid women workers, educators in early childhood education, and aged care workers. So obviously the changes I've seen for them most recently is the big lift in pay, because certainly I think the structural barriers which Kate identified, which certainly I have seen as a union official, that are there that prevent women from moving forward. And if you look at the pay of early educators and aged care workers, whilst the Fair Work Commissions were there, the laws were there, the reality is, because of the Harvester decision way back in 1901 that set the wage for women at 75%, it just never was big enough. And to ask a Fair Work Commission to give women a wage increase of 30% was unheard of and was never going to happen. But that's actually what needed to happen to that wage to make it fair. And so the money that we have contributed to, particularly the wages of educators and aged care workers, is really historic. But so what I've seen over my time, particularly as a union official, are those structural barriers. And we still have the most gender segregated workforce in the world, so there's still a way for us to go, and we still see a lot of men heading up our companies and other organisations. So those structural barriers are the hardest to move. And I think when I was talking to Kate about doing this talk, I said, unless they say the sky is going to fall in, or when they say that, we know we're on the right track. And it was great to see that flyer way back when, again, that the sky will fall in. And we've heard that over and over again as women fighting for just equal say in society. So those changes I've seen as a union official over time, but really it's the structural nature of our society that tends to hold people back. And it's interesting that you put the statistics up for First Nations people, because when you look back at the Uluru Statement of the Heart, which also talks about the structural nature of our problem, and it is, again, the structural nature of the problem. So, and I find that certainly when I became the president, I'm the first Labor president, I'm only the second female president of the Senate. when I was with the Speaker, who, you know, he's a terrific speaker, and I'm so glad to work with him across this Parliament, people would see him and then see me and just assume I was the executive assistant, or I've even been referred to as Mrs. Dick, but don't tell him that. He's very embarrassed about that. And I can joke about that because, as you can imagine, as a trade union official, I've come up a lot against a lot of gender segregation in my time. But it's the structural barriers we really need to challenge about why things are done. And so often I hear, well, that's the way it's always been done, but it doesn't mean that that's the way it's got to be done. So I think in answer to your question, Jackie, I really look at the structural nature of how we got to a place and try and bring that undone. I mean, that people do say to me that I've made a difference in this place, but it is hard to actually see that. Except one day we were having a tough time in the Senate, and two of the attendants said to me as I walked into chair, they went, "Oh, we feel better because you're here." So I don't know. I think it's big things and little things, but the biggest issues I see for women are the structural barriers that we've created as a society.
I realise we're leaving some questions on the floor, but time is defeating us, and I think it's a nice note to finish on. Thank you both for being open to questions and for a lovely speech.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.